There is a certain kind of woman who leaves a man feeling completely uncertain about where he stands. She is not the woman who constantly sends messages throughout the day. She is not the woman who openly advertises her feelings or makes every interaction easy to interpret. In fact, if you were asked to describe her, you might say she seems independent, slightly guarded, and difficult to read. From the outside, she appears perfectly comfortable keeping a little distance between herself and everyone else. Because of that, many men immediately assume there is nothing deeper happening beneath the surface. They believe attraction should always be obvious. They expect interest to arrive with clear signals, direct attention, and unmistakable enthusiasm. If a woman likes them, surely she would make it easier to see. Surely she would find excuses to spend more time around them. Surely she would remove all uncertainty. But human emotions rarely operate that neatly. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that everyone responds to attraction in exactly the same way. Some people become more expressive when they care. Others become more cautious. Some move closer. Others create distance while they try to understand what they are feeling. What looks like indifference on the surface can sometimes be uncertainty, self-protection, or even emotional vulnerability hidden behind a calm exterior. Think about how much more pressure exists when someone genuinely matters. When there is no emotional investment, interactions feel effortless because there is very little at stake. But when someone begins occupying your thoughts, every conversation suddenly feels more significant. Every impression matters a little more. Every interaction carries a little more weight than before. That is why attraction can sometimes create behavior that appears contradictory. A woman who feels nothing may seem completely relaxed. Meanwhile, a woman who secretly finds herself thinking about someone often becomes more aware of everything she says and does. She starts paying closer attention to how she is perceived. She wonders whether she is revealing too much. She becomes careful in ways she never expected. Ironically, the deeper the interest becomes, the less obvious it can sometimes appear. This is where most men completely miss what is happening. They focus only on dramatic signs while ignoring the subtle patterns quietly unfolding in front of them. They pay attention to grand gestures, but overlook the small moments that reveal where a person's mind keeps returning. They look for certainty while missing the clues hidden inside ordinary interactions. The reality is that genuine interest often reveals itself through consistency rather than intensity. It appears through repeated behaviors that seem insignificant on their own, but become meaningful when viewed together. A glance that happens more than once, a detail remembered long after a conversation ended, an unexpected moment of attention that keeps repeating itself over time. These small behaviors rarely attract immediate attention because each one appears harmless by itself. Yet, when they begin forming a pattern, they tell a completely different story. A story about curiosity, a story about emotional investment, a story about someone who may be thinking about you far more often than you realize. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that many men witness these behaviors every day without recognizing what they mean. They interpret caution as disinterest. They mistake emotional restraint for emotional absence. They convince themselves that nothing is happening when in reality something much deeper may be quietly developing beneath the surface. What we're about to explore are the subtle patterns that often reveal attraction long before anyone openly admits it. And the first clue appears long before words ever enter the picture. It begins with something most people never notice at all, where her attention naturally goes when she believes nobody is watching. The first pattern often appears before a woman has spoken a single extra word, sent a single unexpected message, or done anything that would seem obviously romantic. It begins with attention. More specifically, it begins with where her attention goes when she believes nobody is paying attention to her. Most people underestimate how revealing attention can be. They assume attraction starts with action, when in reality, it often starts with observation. Before someone feels comfortable expressing interest, they usually become curious. They begin noticing things. They start paying attention to details that would normally pass unnoticed. Imagine being in a social setting. People are talking, laughing, moving around the room, focused on their own conversations. Then, at some point, you happen to glance across the room and notice her looking in your direction. The moment eye contact happens, she quickly redirects her attention elsewhere. Many men dismiss moments like this immediately. They convince themselves it was random. They assume she was looking at something behind them. They tell themselves it could not possibly mean anything important, and sometimes they are right. But attraction is rarely revealed through a single moment. It is revealed through repetition. When someone consistently captures our interest, our attention naturally returns to them. Not because we consciously decide to monitor them, but because our minds become curious about what they are doing, what they are saying, and who they are becoming. The more emotionally interesting a person becomes, the more difficult it is to completely ignore them. What makes this particularly interesting is that curiosity often grows before confidence does. A woman may find herself interested in a man long before she feels comfortable expressing that interest openly. As a result, she observes from a distance, she gathers information, she pays attention quietly. This same pattern has become even easier to notice in today's digital world. Perhaps you post online and notice she consistently views it almost immediately. Maybe she seems unusually aware of events happening in your life, despite the fact that you haven't spoken recently. Sometimes she references something you shared days ago that most people would have forgotten within minutes. These moments seem small, but they often reveal something important. People invest attention where emotional value exists. The average person has countless things competing for their focus every day: work responsibilities, family obligations, personal goals, entertainment, stress. Yet, despite all of those distractions, certain individuals manage to remain in their thoughts. Those are usually the people who carry some level of emotional significance. This does not mean every glance signals attraction. It does not mean every social media view is secretly meaningful. That kind of thinking leads people into assumptions that often create unnecessary confusion. Instead, look for consistency. Does her attention repeatedly drift toward you over time? Does she seem unusually aware of things happening in your life? Does she notice details that others miss? Does she continue showing signs of awareness even when there is no obvious reason to do so? When these behaviors begin appearing together, they often point towards something much deeper than simple coincidence, because attention is rarely random for very long. And once attention becomes strong enough, something even more revealing starts to happen. A woman who consistently notices you often begins remembering things about you that most people would have forgotten long ago. That is where the next sign becomes impossible to ignore. Attention is powerful, but attention by itself is only the beginning. The next pattern becomes much harder to dismiss because it reveals that your presence is not only capturing her attention, it is staying in her mind long after your interactions have ended. The second sign is that she remembers details about you that most people would have forgotten weeks ago. This is where many men begin to underestimate what is really happening. They assume a woman simply has a good memory. They assume she remembers everyone's stories equally. They tell themselves that the detail she recalled was probably insignificant. But there is an important difference between remembering information and remembering a person. When someone occupies a meaningful place in our thoughts, the details connected to them tend to stick. Conversations linger longer. Small facts become easier to recall. Stories remain accessible in our memory because they are attached to someone we find emotionally interesting. Imagine mentioning a future event during a casual conversation. Perhaps you tell her about an important meeting, a family gathering, or a project you've been working on. Days pass, maybe even weeks. You've forgotten you ever mentioned it. Then suddenly she asks how it went. The question catches you off guard, not because the event was important, but because she remembered. The same thing happens when she recalls a restaurant you wanted to visit, a hobby you mentioned briefly, or a story about your childhood that appeared only once in conversation. These details are rarely necessary. They provide her with no practical advantage. Yet somehow they remain stored in her mind. That is often because emotionally significant people are processed differently by the brain. Think about your own experiences. Every week you meet people, have conversations, and exchange information. Most of it disappears quickly. Names fade, stories become blurry, details get replaced by newer information. This is completely normal, yet certain people remain easier to remember. A random comment they made weeks ago stays clear. A story they told continues resurfacing in your thoughts. Small details become attached to a person who matters, which makes those details much harder to forget. The same process often happens when a woman develops a growing interest in someone. What's fascinating is that she may not even realize she is doing it. Nobody consciously decides to memorize another person's favorite food, childhood story, or future plans. The process happens naturally because attention creates emotional importance, and emotional importance strengthens memory. This becomes especially noticeable when she remembers things that other people consistently overlook. Perhaps she recalls the name of your sibling after hearing it once. Maybe she remembers a goal you mentioned months ago. Maybe she follows up on something you completely forgot sharing. Those moments often reveal something larger than simple politeness. They suggest that your conversations are continuing long after they officially end. The interesting part is that attention and memory rarely exist alone. When someone repeatedly occupies a person's thoughts, those thoughts often find their way into conversations with trusted friends. And that is where the next sign becomes even more revealing because it no longer involves her memory at all. It involves the people closest to her and what they already seem to know about you before you've even met them. One of the strongest clues that a woman is thinking about you more than she admits often appears when you are not even around to witness it. In fact, it frequently reveals itself through the people closest to her. The third sign is that her friends seem to know far more about you than you would expect. This is a fascinating pattern because it exposes what may be happening behind the scenes. A woman can carefully control what she says to you. She can appear relaxed. She can hide uncertainty. She can make her feelings difficult to read. But what becomes much harder to control is what happens when she is talking to the people she trusts most. Human beings naturally process emotions through conversation. When something excites us, confuses us, or captures our attention, we often discuss it with close friends. We ask questions. We share experiences. We seek reassurance. We look for perspective. Attraction is no exception. Imagine a woman who finds herself thinking about a particular man more often than she expected. Maybe she is replaying conversations in her mind. Maybe she is wondering whether he feels the same way. Maybe she is trying to understand why certain interactions stay with her long after they happen. Eventually, those thoughts often become conversations. A trusted friend hears about the funny thing you said. A sister learns about an interaction that made her smile. A best friend hears questions she cannot answer alone. Before long, the people closest to her may know your name, know pieces of your story, and know much more about you than you realize. This is why some men are surprised when they encounter her friends. Perhaps you arrive at a social gathering and notice one of her friends immediately recognizes you, despite never having formally met. Maybe someone gives her a knowing smile when you walk into the room. Maybe a friend seems unusually interested in speaking with you. At first, these moments can seem meaningless, but when they happen repeatedly, they often suggest that your name has appeared in conversations long before your arrival. Sometimes the signs become even more obvious. A friend might accidentally reveal familiarity with details you never shared directly. Someone might tease her in a playful way when you approach. Another friend might suddenly become curious about your personality, your interests, or your intentions. These reactions rarely happen without context. People generally do not spend significant time discussing individuals who hold no emotional importance. The more frequently someone appears in conversation, the more familiar they become to the people listening. Of course, context always matters. Friends may know about someone for many reasons. That is why no single sign should be viewed in isolation. However, when her friends seem unusually aware of who you are, when they react differently around you, and when they appear to observe the connection between the two of you, it often suggests that you have become a recurring topic in conversations taking place behind closed doors. And that is where things become even more interesting, because the next sign is one that confuses men more than almost any other. Many see it as evidence that a woman is losing interest, when in reality, it can sometimes signal that her emotional investment is becoming stronger than ever. The fourth sign is that she unexpectedly reaches out, creates a meaningful interaction, and then seems to disappear again. Few behaviors create more confusion than this one. One moment, everything feels promising. A message appears out of nowhere. Maybe she sends something funny that reminded her of you. Maybe she asks a question she could have easily asked someone else. Maybe she brings up a conversation you had weeks ago as though it happened yesterday. The interaction feels effortless. The conversation flows naturally. There is warmth. There is engagement. There is a sense of connection that feels genuine rather than forced. For a brief period, it seems like the distance between the two of you is finally shrinking. Then something unexpected happens. She becomes quiet again. Hours pass, then days, sometimes even longer. Naturally, most men immediately assume the worst. They replay every message, they search for mistakes, they wonder whether they said something wrong or whether she suddenly changed her mind. What many fail to consider is that attraction can create internal conflict. When someone means very little to us, there is almost nothing to process emotionally. Interactions remain simple. They come and go without much impact. But when someone begins occupying a larger space in our thoughts, the emotional stakes become higher. A woman who feels a growing connection may suddenly become more aware of her own vulnerability. After a positive interaction, she may find herself thinking more deeply about where things could lead. She may question her feelings. She may wonder whether she is becoming too emotionally invested. She may even become nervous about how much she enjoyed the conversation. As strange as it sounds, sometimes the very thing that draws her closer is the same thing that causes her to step back temporarily. Imagine she has been thinking about you throughout the week. A song reminds her of something you said. A funny moment makes her think of a previous conversation. A random thought brings your name into her mind. Eventually, she acts on that impulse and reaches out. The conversation goes well, perhaps even better than expected. But instead of eliminating uncertainty, the interaction makes her feelings feel more real. Suddenly, the connection no longer exists only inside her thoughts. It becomes something she can feel. For some women, that emotional awareness creates a temporary need for distance. Not because they are losing interest, because they are trying to understand the growing importance of the connection. This is why patterns matter so much. A woman who disappears completely is very different from a woman who repeatedly finds her way back into your life. One suggests detachment. The other suggests ongoing curiosity and emotional investment. If she consistently reappears after periods of distance, if she keeps reopening conversations, if she repeatedly creates new opportunities for connection, there is usually a reason behind it. People rarely continue returning to something that holds no value for them. Of course, this does not mean every disappearing act should be interpreted as attraction. Some people are genuinely busy. Some communicate inconsistently. Others simply enjoy casual attention. That is why context is everything. When this behavior appears alongside the other patterns we have discussed, the picture begins to change. She notices you, she remembers details about you. Her friends seem unusually aware who you are. She keeps finding reasons to reconnect even after creating distance. Taken together, these signs begin telling a story that is difficult to ignore. And the next sign may be even more revealing because it often happens without conscious effort. It appears when her behavior around you starts changing in ways that do not happen around anyone else. The fifth sign is that she behaves differently around you than she does around everyone else. This is one of the most overlooked indicators of attraction because people tend to focus on words instead of behavior. They listen for confessions. They wait for obvious compliments. They search for direct statements that remove all uncertainty. Meanwhile, they completely miss the subtle shifts happening right in front of them. When a person feels emotionally neutral towards someone, their behavior tends to remain consistent. They act roughly the same way, regardless of who is present. There is little emotional adjustment because there is little emotional investment. But when someone begins to matter, things often change. The change is not always dramatic. In fact, it is usually quite subtle. For some women, attraction makes them quieter. This surprises many men because they assume interest should automatically create more conversation and more confidence. Yet emotions often work in the opposite direction. The more someone's opinion matters, the more self-aware a person can become. A woman who normally speaks freely may suddenly pause before answering. She may think more carefully about what she says. She may become slightly nervous in situations where she is usually completely relaxed. The difference is not that she has lost confidence. The difference is that the interaction suddenly feels important. Other women react in the opposite way. Instead of becoming quieter, they become more animated. Their energy increases. Their laughter becomes more frequent. They appear more engaged and more attentive. Conversations seem to flow more naturally when you are around than when they are speaking with others. The specific reaction is not what matters most. What matters is the contrast. Notice how she interacts with other people, then notice how she interacts with you. Does her body language change? Does her tone of voice become warmer? Does she seem more attentive? Does she appear more aware of herself? Does she remember your comments more often than everyone else's? These differences often reveal emotions that words never fully express. What makes this sign particularly powerful is that it is difficult to fake consistently. People can carefully choose their words. They can hide their feelings behind logic and self-control. But controlling every small behavioral shift is much harder. Emotions tend to leak through tiny actions. A slightly longer glance, a smile that appears more naturally, a subtle adjustment in posture, a sudden increase in attentiveness. Small changes that seem insignificant individually can become highly revealing when they happen repeatedly. This becomes especially noticeable in group settings. Watch how she interacts with everyone else. Then compare that behavior to how she responds when you enter the conversation. Sometimes the difference is small. Sometimes it is surprisingly obvious once you know what to look for. The key is not searching for perfection. The key is observing patterns. If she consistently pays attention to you, remembers details about you, finds reasons to reconnect, and behaves differently around you than around everyone else, a larger picture begins to emerge. And that picture often becomes even clearer when another pattern appears, because the next sign is one that many men completely misunderstand. They see it as a problem when it can actually indicate that she is taking them far more seriously than they realize. It appears when she begins paying close attention to how they respond under pressure and whether their actions truly match the person they claim to be. The sixth sign is that she begins testing your reactions. The moment many men hear the word test, they immediately think about manipulation, mind games, or unnecessary drama. Because of that assumption, they often miss what is really happening beneath the surface. Most of the time, these tests are not about making your life difficult. They are about gathering information. When a woman becomes emotionally invested, she starts caring about something she did not care about before. She is no longer evaluating a stranger. She is evaluating someone who could potentially become important in her life. And whenever emotions become involved, people naturally become more careful. Think about it this way, or does he remain calm, confident, and emotionally steady? What many men fail to realize is that emotional stability is incredibly attractive. Anyone can appear confident when everything is going exactly as planned. Real confidence reveals itself when circumstances become uncertain. That is why these situations matter. A woman who is becoming emotionally invested wants reassurance that her feelings are being directed towards someone reliable. She wants to know that the version of you she sees during good moments is the same version that exists during challenging moments. Ironically, many men sabotage themselves here. The moment they feel uncertainty, they react impulsively, they become impatient, they seek constant reassurance, they interpret every small challenge as a threat. Without realizing it, they reveal exactly the insecurity she was trying to understand in the first place. Of course, not every disagreement or delayed response is a hidden test. That would be an unhealthy way to view relationships. The goal is not to analyze every interaction. The goal is to notice patterns. If she consistently pays attention to you, remembers details, finds reasons to reconnect, behaves differently around you, and then becomes highly observant of your reactions, a larger picture begins forming. She is no longer simply curious, she is evaluating. An evaluation often appears when someone is becoming emotionally invested rather than emotionally detached, which brings us to the final sign. In many ways, it is the most powerful of all because it ties every other pattern together. It reveals whether you are simply someone she occasionally notices or someone she repeatedly finds her way back to, no matter how much time passes between interactions. The final sign is that she keeps finding reasons to bring herself back into your world. At first glance, this may seem like the least important sign of all. After all, a message is just a message. A comment is just a comment. A conversation is just a conversation. But when you step back and examine the larger pattern, you begin to realize that these moments often reveal far more than they appear to on the surface. Human beings naturally move toward what occupies their thoughts. We create opportunities to reconnect with people who matter to us. We notice things that remind us of them. We find excuses to maintain contact even when those